Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Dilly, CEO of Awesome, and I'd like to welcome you to today's cross-industry collaboration. I'm really excited about spending the next hour with all of you. You know, I love these cross-industry collaborations because they're informational sessions where through data, analytics, and brainstorming, we can learn together and create solutions for some of our industry's biggest challenges. And today's topic for our program is looking at the aerospace industry specifically. There's so much going on in this space, and it's really exciting to hear about what's happening and how we can learn from the work that they're doing to take across to other industries in our supply chain industry. This is going to be an interactive session, so really encouraging everybody to be involved, raise hand, ask questions, maybe ask how it might be pertinent or relevant to the work that you're doing. We have a wonderful group of Deloitte executives who will be sharing their expertise on what's happening with challenges, successes, and how they're using technology and innovation. So, a great resource for each and every one of us to learn from and to get their perspective on the work that we're doing. So, I encourage you all to be actively participating in that. I'm thrilled to have an amazing subject matter expert walk us through this information. So later on in a little bit, we'll be hearing from Lindsay Berkman, who's the principal at Deloitte Consulting and the leader of the U.S. Aerospace and Defense practice. So we are getting the best expertise from the top. So thank you, Lindsay, for joining us today. And to begin with, I'm going to have Rachel White, who is in the Deloitte supply chain practice, go ahead and do a quick introduction. So I am going to hand it over to you, Rachel. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm really, really excited to bring this topic to you today. This is also special to me as well as I started my own career in aerospace when I started in supply chain. And that's actually how I met our presenter today, Lindsay Berkman. I remember when I was starting my career, her kind of pulling me aside as a new woman in a very largely male-dominated field and was able to kind of provide some support and mentorship there. So I would say that not only she has a ton of experience just for the industry itself, but I think especially in such a field that can be male dominated, it's wonderful to see a mentor and an executive kind of leading the charge, something to look up to. So really, really excited for you all to hear from Lindsay today. And before we jump into the session itself, we just wanted to have two quick polling questions to just get a sense of the group that's here with us today and understand a little bit about kind of your background. So I know we have a little bit of a smaller group, but wanted to just launch the first polling question uh, and the second as well, just about what industry that you currently work in and how familiar are you with the topic of aerospace and global aerospace trends. So I'll give you just a minute to respond to that. And if you do select other, feel free to pop in the chat of maybe what specific industry you do work in, just so that we can gauge. Awesome. So it looks like we're mostly CPG and kind of a little split there. So that sounds good. So I think we can probably get started and jump into aerospace. So let me share out and I'll pass it over to Lindsay to start talking us through.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I know it's a tough time of year with just gearing into the holidays here and lots to finish up. So appreciate those that could join and those that will probably catch it on recording thereafter, but I'm very much looking forward to it. So my name is Lindsay Berkman. Appreciate the introduction by both of my colleagues there. I have been in the aerospace and defense arena for the last 18 years, really at the intersection of operations and technology, and also at Deloitte for that same amount of time. So from the get-go, when I first started with my career, started to be on programs or I was on the shop floor, understanding how some of those programs came to fruition, really dealing with the complexity of the builds, of their engineering designs, of what that means for supply chain, and then how do you back that and how do you enable it with technology. Over time, that took me into smart factory domains of completely reinventing and rethinking about how we do operations. And now I play a very broad role across all of the ways that you think about aerospace and defense, what it means from how contracting is shifting, how you think about production at these programs, the longevity, aftermarket, and everything in between. So it's been a fantastic journey. I've loved it. It's kept me entertained, certainly. And what I'll say is this is a really interesting time for aerospace and defense. In those 20 years, there's been a lot of movement, but all the same big companies and a lot of the same turf and domain. In reality, in the last 5 years, we've seen a proliferation of players and entities that are contributing to this space, which is fantastic. Um, in these last couple of years, we've seen a real shift in the posture of how contracting can work, and data requirements and things along those lines of kind of the future and the advanced sides of the defense market, certainly, but even how we'll reinvent commercial aerospace. And even more recently, we've seen pretty decent shifts in the types of vehicles that will be used and can be used to be able to compete in this future landscape. And so, with all that said, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's a very fascinating time to think about this market space, where investments are going, where money is going, and what precedent that can set for other manufacturers across the US and globally. Of course, aerospace and defense is a largely US landed manufacturing set, although there's international work, of course. And so there's a lot of momentum and specialty that's baked into these industries, both the primes and the tier one. And it's very interesting to kind of use A&D as a little bit of a harbinger for what could happen across the US landscape, especially as we think about those investments in the future. So good to be with you here today. And certainly, if I can connect with any of you afterwards, I will. One other personal note, based in Philadelphia, but grew up in Utah, really enjoy getting outside as much as I can and going to Antarctica in 10 days for the holidays. So I'm looking forward to that as well. I travel prolifically. Okay, so with that, let's get into the content. Would love to share a little bit in just 2 seconds as I plug in my computer because I was tardy in doing that prior. Okay, let's go into the top industry trends, if you will. And what I will say is Deloitte publishes an article in the beginning of the tail end of each year to look at the major trends that are going to be that we're foreseeing in that next calendar year. So parts of this will feature the 2025 report as well as the 2026 report of how do we think about what's happening in this market space in this domain. We will certainly send some of those links after the fact as well, if that's helpful to anybody as you would try to understand this space and this industry. So let's go through this, and then we have some backup pages to each one of these, as you can imagine. First and foremost, we actually are seeing a huge trend against aftermarket. And how do you think about reinventing the business and how it serves its products after they are fielded or in their various domains and their theaters? This is really important to aerospace. Many of the planes that you fly on are 30 plus years old. There are long maintenance cycles and very nuanced ways to think about the survivability and the maintenance of these assets to keep them in top-notch performance. And so how to completely overhaul and make that more efficient and more margin accretive on the back end is going to be important, especially as contracting could shift differently in terms of the kinds of assets that we use. So thing one is how do you optimize around aftermarket? Thing two, of course, we couldn't get through 15 minutes of a meeting without saying AI. How do how do these companies really reinvent the way that they do business with AI? And I think this one's fascinating for aerospace. Their products have always had this on it in ways that we probably, before we were using this as a buzzword, there are drones that can multi-network with a satellite that can behave and create activity that would otherwise be kind of unheard of. And so there's a lot of capability in intercomputer networking and things along those lines from a defense practice, as you can imagine. However, there's so much more to do. And how do they really use AI to modernize the way that they do business versus just what's on their assets is really what number two is all about. Number three, how do we think about net new space vehicle or net new vehicles? And you've heard me mention that a little bit before, but there is energy around space, as you know. There will be continued energy and investment in space domains, both the shuttles and the vehicles as we think about how to get there, but then what you do in space and what that means to cyber protect it. There is new energy around unmanned systems. Drones are not new. Unmanned vehicles and unmanned aircraft are not new. However, that's going to continue to grow and the fit and format will change and be smaller. We've seen certain activity with Ukraine that is indicative of a full shift of how those vehicles will work in the future. There is focus on hypersonics. How do we travel differently? How do we look at supersonics and hypersonics? And so lots of information and focus on the funding that goes into rocket technologies and other ways that we can propel vehicles from traditional engines and things along those lines. And then even in the commercial aerospace side, advanced air mobility in terms of air taxis is getting a lot of traction. We're going to see that pick up likely in Dubai and other geographies first before the US, but they're certainly working quickly towards certification. And even net new wing bodies and kind of aircraft in general that we could see coming up in the next 4 to 5 years. So a ton of new entrants, which is exciting, I think, for all of us involved. And I kind of tapped into 4 with the advanced air mobility there. And then 5 will be not a surprise to anybody, and this will be true of any manufacturing domain, but certainly top of mind always and continues to be around supply chain disruption, volatility, and resiliency. This has been ongoing way before I started, and of course it'll continue, but COVID certainly shined a light in terms of global logistics. Tariffs has magnified that times 10 of who's doing what where, your manufacturing footprint and strategy, your parts strategy, your dual sourcing strategy, and how to keep those lines resilient, regardless of what's happening from a geopolitical sphere or otherwise. And so lots of good thinking in and around how to modernize supply chains, create better visibility and more resiliency. I'll pause there. We don't have another polling question, but if there's any questions on those or anything that you wanted to bring up, feel free to chime in the session, or we can come to it at the end as well.
I'm really fascinated to hear more about section number 4 with the autonomous driving machines. Just given everything that you're seeing in the news today about Waymo and the issues that they're having, it'll be interesting to hear. Maybe you can share more insights as to kind of what's happening in that space. And do they learn from what's happening from Waymo?
Yeah, the domains that they play in and the fields that they can play in of where they're going to be most successful is a big piece to this, as well as, of course, airworthiness and air certification. So more to come on that one. But yeah, I have a slide specifically to that point, so that'll be great.
That's great. I
Okay.
want to know when I can drive and when I can fly myself back and forth, across states and cut down on
Me too.
traffic.
Trust me, that would make my life a
Right?
lot easier if I had
Exactly.
that magic tool. I always say that my secret power would be teleportation because that would make my life just a lot easier if I could get to where I needed to go. Okay, well, let's get into some of the details here. And again, feel free to chime in. I'm going to talk about 3 and 4 in that prior page first around some of the investment that's really happening. And then we'll kind of come back to some of the more foundational or functional type of opportunities. So, as we look at the funding that's going to hypersonics, supersonics, missile defense, rockets, and space, this is just a quick page to put that into light. We have seen incredible passage, if you will, of additional funding to go towards these specific spaces. In that first bar, that $831 billion allocation, that's exceeding prior expectations, signaling robust commitment to defense modernization overall. And really what that tells me is that the next generation technologies and evolving defense priorities are seen and recognized of what they need to do to continue to modernize the way that we think of our military assets and our crafts. And so there will be a ton of funding that goes those ways.
Mm.
Important investment areas include those advanced aircraft, so fifth and sixth generation aircraft to maintain them back into the aftermarket space and commit to ongoing threats. Unmanned systems is tremendous. Space systems is very, very high for space and missile defense, especially getting into hypersonics. And how do we think about that as a contested domain? In what for the competition and how we cyber secure any of the satellites that are out there. And then Golden Dome, I won't say is new, but that is continuing to gain more traction as well. There has been some initial funding and certainly expecting quite a bit more. And really all players are interested in how this will work. That will be a space and prime kind of consortium of all different entities coming together to be able to achieve those objectives. Now, granted, they're pretty lofty, but as that kind of defines and as that shapes, that's really to protect against ongoing threats. And throughout all of this, I think there's a big opportunity for industry collaboration and ecosystem.
Mm.
Looking through the entire ecosystem of how we work together on strategic programs. There's going to be partnerships by technology firms and defense contractors. There's going to be a ton of startups that come into this space. I think there's opportunities for mid and small size businesses to understand these objectives and what the government is really going for with this kind of funding vehicles to be able to accelerate activity. And importantly, I think we're going to see a change in the acquisition strategy and in contracting, which is also really important here. Historically, the military would contract towards very specific specifications of what they wanted. We are now in a time where there is more openness to compete on mission versus on specification. And that's an interesting piece, right? What that means is, can you meet the intent of what's supposed to happen versus the exact specification I gave you of what's supposed to happen? And for reasons like that is why we're catching rockets right now on boats, right? Or with chopsticks.
Yeah.
So that's an indication of like a different way of thinking about contracting that will open up, I think, other avenues for different players to compete. And again, big partnerships with the tech players as well.
That's really interesting, but it's exciting to see, right? That shift from a more traditional supply chain to more innovative partners. So that's really
Correct.
interesting.
And more kind of commercial behavior around thinking around like what is
Yeah.
good and right to meet this mission versus um, just meeting the letter of the law, right? And it's a change for any of the companies, right? Legacy companies are used to a certain way of doing business, and this will change
Hmm.
that. So I think it's opportunity for some, it's change for others, it's all the above. And so, how do you think about playing in this new domain will really matter.
So can I ask you a question around the supply base? And so I have a lot of experience in appliances, and our supply base had a crossover with automotive significantly, like 65% crossover. What other industries are crossover industries that would partner or that could take advantage of what's happening in the aerospace for their different industry sectors?
Many. I think we typically see that the two most analogous for very different reasons are auto for sure,
Hmm.
as well as uh, actually healthcare and high tech. Oh, well, sorry,
Mm.
I'd put those into different categories. High tech. What is a missile is truly a lot of circuit cards and circuitry that just has also a bomb associated with it, right? So um, so I think high tech is a big player of what, and that from like a rare earth and a supply chain perspective, that gets into some of those same domains.
Hmm.
And then healthcare and pharma, but for very different reasons, largely in the upfront engineering and the regulation that goes into that of creation, right? Other industries have kind of a playbook of what they're creating. I'd argue that med tech, healthcare, and A&D are usually in the forefront of creating before the ask has been made. And
Hmm.
that's kind of the delta there that you'll start to see with like model-based engineering plays
Hmm.
very heavily into those two highly regulated but very inventive spaces.
Interesting. Thanks.
Mhm. So that's just a little bit of the landscape from a US government funding perspective, and now a little bit of a different bend. Now looking at more the commercial side. This is more focused on advanced air mobility, but there's certainly things happening in fixed wing as well. But on advanced air mobility, or AAM as we call it, what's really happening there? There are a litany of companies that are out there that have emerged over these last 5 years. All are racing towards prototypes and first flight. A couple have accomplished that. That would be like an Archer, a Joby, a number of other Wisp, a number of other players that are out there. And of course, the race is for actual certification of where they can fly and how soon they might be able to. So there are, and these could be manned, they could be unmanned. There's lots of different opportunities. Most of these are electric. Some are, some are not. So there's lots of permutations in terms of this market space of how to think about it. The certification roadmap is pending and is imminent. There are a lot of activities going on in this space, but there have been some delays in this past year that are going to really take some time for the government to get around in and around air traffic, which would impact where these types of assets could fly. Based on that, OEMs are planning to ramp production, assuming certification, but the US might be a harder domain to play in right off of the bat. And so we're likely to see a lot of these assets, once they achieve airworthiness, start to fly in the Middle East. We're seeing some of the UAE and other domains such as that are investing big and are planning for this type of activity to happen in the future. And so with their regulation set being very different than ours, we're likely to see first flight happen in other geographies. And that would be something that the US piggybacks and runs from or runs with. There's conversations in where these types of assets would fly. Is it better to have as like a center city hub to rural domains? Is it better to be in a pure urban theater, right? And what is their range? How does that work? What is the pricing strategy? There's a ton of things that come into play here with the intent of building them for the more common customer. This shouldn't just be the people that own helicopters today. It should really be something net different in terms of how we think about it, almost like a souped-up Uber service. So there's plenty of discussions here, but I'd say again, like another place in which the aerospace market is shifting to be able to have new entrants such as this come in.
So, with the geopolitical environment that it is today, how is that impacting the supply chain maybe differently than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
The supply chain or the kind of certification of these types of vehicles?
Oh, actually, both.
So the certification, couple things. I think there's still a focus on infrastructure for vertiports and things along those lines of how do you
Hmm.
continue to play in this space. And so I think they are prepping and getting more assets and kind of more momentum behind that. Truly, the tragedies of earlier this year with the DCA crash and things along those lines have also impacted this. That was a helicopter accident. So
Right.
again, what spaces these play into kind of plays into the security of our overall FAA landscape and how we
Hmm.
see air traffic control. So there's some intersecting priorities there.
Hmm.
Which is why I say that urban areas versus rural areas are a key
Yeah.
use case. I can tell you, for example, Utah's investing quite a bit in and around the Olympics is the plan, but to take a city center like Salt Lake that has a big hospital that has certain assets, right? And then be able to distribute that to more rural areas around it is another use case where you'd have a lot less air congestion that could present new opportunity.
And then piggyback, working in healthcare, right? Like the advantages of that crossover. That's actually really interesting
And
model to think
before we
about.
fly humans, we'll likely transport stuff. So I bet we'll
Right.
we'll transport med tech, we'll transport medicines. A lot of the drone studies that you're starting to see of getting the general public comfortable with seeing things in the air are in and
Hmm.
around and in advance of this.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of what's happening around the block, let's just say, in terms of funding and investments and priorities. So now let's talk a little bit about how these companies then are organizing around it and what it's meant from a supply chain perspective. So As I said, 2025 will likely be a year of differentiation and difficulty, I'd say, for these companies. This was one of our slides from the beginning of 2025. I know we've all lived through quite the year, and so a lot has changed and has happened. But I do think these still ring true, and we'll continue to talk about how that reflects in 2026 now. Um, but this page kind of gives us a view of like what are the areas that they most need to modernize to be able to meet the needs that were on those prior two pages, right? So they need to build that supply chain resiliency and understanding from a cost perspective of what that looks like, especially in this tariff landscape. They still have a huge challenge with workforce. How do they continue to raise the bar there and be able to attract the talent that they need to be able to support these industries as we go forward? And by the way, A&D wages typically average above the national average, but attrition remains at 2 times the national rate. So that's just an example of how
Mm,
strapped these industries are specifically for talent. If you can think about it, of the big engineering schools that would have attracted towards, let's say, a defense company in the past, now they would go to an Apple or Google or something along those lines. So the way that the industries are competing is quite different, and that matters for that talent workforce as well.
mhm.
Aftermarket, as we said, keep things in the air and make sure that we're designing for that. And then regulatory, of course, lots of movement here with this administration, but even former, that matters in terms of how these assets play and who can participate and the barriers to entry. And again, contracting on mission versus on spec. All of this would have an AI bend to it. All of this has a technology bend to it, right? Of how they're modernizing behind the scenes as well. Okay. So speaking to that, if we go to the next page here, um, what does this mean about technology, right? And I think can pretty confidently say across manufacturing, but certainly in aerospace, that there's more work to do, right? Everybody talks a great game, and there's a lot of good momentum, but in terms of making this part of DNA or making it consistent, there is much more work to go get done, in
Mm.
terms of how companies actually run their business and how do they leverage digital tools and AI to be able to create new capabilities and capacity. So there is a tremendous focus on any company, I'm sure yours and the ones that I support as well, around how to use AI, how to use agentic capabilities in both the development of assets as well as on product and in terms of how you run the business. So we're expecting huge investments in this space. People are already making them, and we're starting to see some of the benefits of all of that. There will also be a point in time of where we pick our battles in terms of where some of this will activate. I'd say that Gen AI is a step function change just as the internet was. So it's significant, it's gigantic, it's huge. Um, will everything be Gen AI tomorrow? No. And there's still plenty of things that will be done in more traditional senses. And so there's plenty of places to know how to create that momentum and that win to reinvent the portions of the business that otherwise have been very back office and tactical. Okay. And what I can say in this, and just even from our own vantage point, there's lots of investments that's going through in terms of tools and what was manual before and visibility and different ways to connect. This will also be a very big ecosystem and collaboration play,
Mhm.
particularly for aerospace. And auto has a little bit of this too, more so than probably the other sectors. There's big consortium plays. They go together to battle on Capitol Hill, right, to get regulations, but for cyber requirements, for supplier performance and kind of consolidation, there's lots of this that will be competitive, and there's some that'll be friendly and kind of consortium based. And so I think there's new norms that are coming through from a technology landscape here in big ways.
That's actually great to see.
Mhm. Okay. So taking us to the next page, we'll talk a little bit about supply chain. So AI, key theme, right, in terms of everything, all the different areas. But now I'm going to come to supply chain, and I mean this actually both in like traditional production as well as in the aftermarket space.
Mhm.
What are we looking at, and what is the the cost of these disruptions, and how do we really think about how to continue to give companies the best shot at producing to the budget that they had planned for, knowing that there's lots of challenges out there. So quality concerns, shipping delays, labor challenges, rising input costs, none of that's new, but all of it has a particularly ominous track of what's happened in 2025, I'd argue, and since COVID, that has made
Hmm.
this a really acute focus. Um, and so I think and I'll just quickly talk a couple points on all of them. I think that the overhaul that we'll see from a defense contracting perspective changes the players, especially in the tier one landscape, and even the lower sub tiers that can start to participate, which is interesting because that creates all sorts of new ways to think about compliance and vendor engagement and supplier engagement. But it
Hmm.
also presents new things to kind of consider. Um, there's also lots of technology that's coming into this space and ways that we think about, just how to kind of tackle these risks that are on this page. With new players coming in, that can be a source of greatness and also a source of quality concerns, especially for long-running assets. Aerospace, of course, any of our industries, but aerospace, of course, has a very high bar and threshold for the quality on any craft and first article inspection and things along those lines. And so that becomes very important. They have less flexibility in their supply chain to make adjustments. Labor challenges we talked about, and I'll have another slide on that here in just a moment. Shipping delays is really a thing about visibility and resiliency and duality of sourcing options. And then
Hmm.
input costs has been a big focus of my year this year in and around tariffs. Uh, that has certainly, I'm sure, impacted everybody here in different ways. Steel and aluminum are still top of the list of things that need to be closely examined. And that creates all sorts of ripple effects of how companies are thinking about this, especially when you get into assets such as aerospace that have that many layers of complexity to their bill of material. So lots of work to get done here. Again, to automate, to create visibility, to use AI tools to continue to modernize the way that supply chain is handled. Okay. And then finally, before I get to the 2026 look ahead, I'll just come back to the labor points that we had mentioned. I think I mentioned the notes around the first pillar here just a moment ago, but aerospace, just like any industry, highly skilled labor is hard to come by. Aerospace has unique challenges, and oftentimes from the defense side has U.S. citizenship requirements. There's challenges in filling engineering and highly skilled roles. There'll be a whole competition for AI type talent to be able to stand up solutions. And there's lots of ways to think about how the competition of a startup company versus a legacy company and how they start to compete with one another and what that's going to look like over time will continue to manifest and take effect here. And so labor continues to be an acute focus, but I can say there's never enough players for what the military strives to do. And you can imagine in that very first page where I showed you the massive funding that's going in from Congress, there are portions of that are actually allocated towards talent development because I think the US is realizing that to compete, we will need to have a stronger base within our defense industrial base and aerospace groups to be able to really navigate this sector and to be able to stand up in the way that we're thinking to really roll up all of those programs.
That's actually really good to hear because it is so critical to invest in the talent, specifically in this space, because it is kind of very focused and unique.
Yeah, and I think, the conversation around AI is like, what jobs does that impact? Every job it'll impact, but
Hmm.
for the sake of productivity, I think in many cases, and this really gets towards there's plenty of work to do with those kinds of ramps and with that kind of invention of new products, highly skilled work, right? And so how do we think
Hmm.
about that, not only from the manufacturing labor side, but also from the front office side and strategy around these programs?
Hmm.
Are there any specific things that they're doing to fill these skilled roles? I think that this problem it's not unique to the aerospace industry. I think a lot of people are having this issue, especially with AI and becoming more prevalent. Are there any things that the aerospace industry is doing specifically that you think could be applied to other industries in terms of labor shortages?
Yeah, I think there are two pieces to that. So one is I'll say the classes coming out of college or university or some of the younger groups. And really, what that's looking at, one of the tactics that they're using is increasingly using their digital platforms, not just for running the business, but to attract and retain talent in the next generation of workers, making roles more tech savvy, using simulation to engage them. Really creating the idea of like flying a plane on a video game versus what you would do as part of your business, right? Like creating a little bit more momentum around how you can engage with this industry, in which otherwise might have been a little bit elusive to some. So there's a lot of work in gamification and immersive training and using digital tools to kind of reinvent the way that you attract talent. There's a lot of investment into the earlier stages of careers and education. STEM kids typically drop out long before they get to high school, and then you've lost them. So, how do you create more interest around STEM and then trades for the actual manufacturing labor workforce to be able to get more engaged? And so, a lot of investments are happening in that regard as well. Um, and then I think from a retention standpoint, a lot of retooling and ways just to kind of work with the workforce to continue to modernize. A&D has always had I'll say an aging workforce. And so as attrition happens, how do you make sure that as new folks are starting to fill those roles that they're coming in with that digitally native perspective?
Hmm.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of this applies to so much of supply chain too, manufacturing jobs and the aging workforce. And so that's really good to hear that they have some tips and tricks.
And I guess to add on to that too, do you feel that there's um, more, at least a little bit more of an appetite from the aging workforce to be open to technologies like AI to kind of try to capture some of that knowledge they have before they leave? And I know that sometimes that can be a tension point. So just kind of curious, as it's continued to be a trend year to year, do you see that there's maybe opening a little bit of that door?
I think yes and no, but I'll answer the question a little bit differently. So I think this is coming. I think people have acknowledged that. I do think it's a matter of how things are introduced, though. No matter who you are, if you know that
Hmm.
you have most people have an iPhone or a smartphone in some way, shape, or form. I know that I don't know how to check into my flight without it buzzing me and telling me when to do it. I know that I order Uber Eats to my house all the time. Not everybody is that maybe digitally native, but people are using their phones for the most part. Um, I think when we talk about how AI would come into the manufacturing floor, we talk about it as if it's like a foreign alien. And in reality, it's not. It's just how do you bring the productivity that we have in our personal lives to check into the flight, to order a car, to do whatever thing we do, to order something online, right? How do we bring that productivity to the shop floor? Imagine if I could see my inventory getting carted to my station, just like Uber Eats carts my food order. Right.
Right.
Imagine if I could select the tool I needed from a crib and then somebody would bring it over to me, which is what I do today. Right. Like I go to TaskRabbit and have somebody bring something to me. um, so and I'm just making myself sound lazy here, but I'm using that as hyperbole for an example, right? Like there's plenty of things that we do, just even getting like a buzz or an alert on our phone, like check into your appointment, your reservation is ready, whatever the case is, that are easy putts to pull into our work life as well. And I think if we start to change the way those introductions happen, it can make people more comfortable faster.
I think you're smart by using those technologies to help make your life easier and more productive.
Well, okay. Exactly. I certainly have to use my phone for everything. I don't even think I know how to get to my own house without Google Maps anymore. So there's that. Okay, so just to the last page here, looking ahead to 2026, this is going to continue to be a hotbed of activity. Many of the themes actually have not really shifted. I think it's just a matter of how to stay competitive now in this new landscape, particularly as the contracting world continues to shift and how these companies do business and the amount of competition that's out there now, some that they haven't really contested with before. And then, of course, AI embedded into anything and everything will be a key theme here. So I think, how I frame it is this is a moment of quite a bit of change within this sector. There's traditional problems like supply chain efficiencies. There's tech problems and tech innovation that's always needed to happen. But now there's new players that are doing all of that at once as well, and like reinventing how some of those things will work. And so I think that creates some real opportunity for people to think differently. And I think to the point you made earlier, A&D is not always the most efficient or a market leader in every single domain, but from an innovation standpoint and how they think about some of those partnerships and kind of the leverage that they have to invent and create, there is a lot of that. And so how do the different groups play off of one another? If there's any questions, would love to chat or and we could certainly end a little bit early, but I appreciate the time and the chance to get with you today. And hopefully this was helpful and informative and touched onto some of the topics that you needed to hear.